This morning we have a somewhat rare opportunity to talk about a lesser-known book of the Old Testament, the book Habakkuk. And Habakkuk is a short, sweet little book by the prophet Habakkuk. It's only 3 chapters in length. But unlike so many other prophets, Habakkuk doesn't address the people of Israel. Most prophets go and address the people of Israel, trying to get them to repent from their ways and turn and return to the Lord. But Habakkuk's book reads differently. It's more like a prayer to God. In it, Habakkuk laments his current state and the state of Israel as an entire nation. Habakkuk, you see, is written just before the Babylonian captivity. Babylon, the neighboring country, nation, comes in and invades them and destroys their temple, takes the Jewish people into exile for 50 years, almost a whole generation, and it's just a miserable time in Israel's history. But before that comes, Habakkuk sees the writing on the wall. Imagine, if you will, his nation, a nation where violence is widespread, a nation where there is destruction at every corner, a nation where laws seem to become slack and where justice doesn't seem to prevail. For Habakkuk, the economic realities of the situation are not equal. The leaders of the nation are corrupt, and there is idolatry that is widespread throughout the country. And so what Habakkuk does is cry out to God in this song, or in this prayer of lament. And the whole book, we're not going to do the whole book, but we're going to do more than we have in the lesson today. The whole book has 4 sections. The first section is Habakkuk crying out initially, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you not listen?" The second section is God's initial response to Habakkuk, which is not in our reading for today, but we'll still talk about it. The third response is from Habakkuk back to God, which is where chapter 2 picks up back in our reading. And the final and 4th section of Habakkuk is God's final vision, his response for the future. So we're going to kind of go through the book of Habakkuk today. But to do so, I'd like to start with just a little story. And again, Habakkuk is written about the nation of Israel. It is kind of a meta-analysis of what's going on, but it doesn't have to just be these grandiose thoughts and feelings about what's going on at the corporate level. It can be about our own individual and personal lives too. Oftentimes, we look at the world and we kind of feel maybe singled out or judged. We feel like things just aren't going our way. And so if you'll allow me, just a little story that is at no way the level of what Habakkuk is dealing with, but in my life it made a big deal. 10 years ago, maybe 12, my sister was in college at Syracuse University, and I was in Baltimore working at St. Paul's School. My mom and my brother and I had gone up to watch one of my sister's crew races up in Syracuse, and after the race, we got back in the car, and we were driving back down through upstate New York back to Philadelphia. And if you've been up in the New England, upstate New York area, you know that the interstates are not like I-95 down here. They're narrow, 2 lanes in either direction. And there are bridges and overpasses every so many miles. I was driving, and Mom and Spencer, my brother, were asleep in the car. And as I came up under one of these bridges, I saw him out of the corner of my eye and immediately slowed down because I knew what was about to happen. The state trooper hiding behind the bridge pulled out, threw his lights on, and I had to pull over. Of course, Spencer and Mom wake up, Mom screaming, "What's happening? What's happening? Why are you slowing down?" "Be quiet, we're getting pulled over," I said. "Why are we getting pulled over? How fast were you going? Why were you going so fast?" To which I said, "Be quiet, we're getting pulled over, it's fine." My brother said, "Yeah, brethren, it's fine. I get pulled over all the time." I wound down the window, and the state trooper walked up, and I was so irritated, so angry at myself, at New York. The trooper said, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Yes, I said with my jaw clenched. And that was the only word I exchanged with the trooper as he came back and brought me my ticket. $145 for going 82 in a 65, plus a $20 court cost. Now, I've learned my lesson. I want to tell you, because some people think that I drive like an old man now. makes one of us. But I got home and I was, again, incensed. And I started scouring this ticket. And if you've gotten a ticket, there's the front page and then there's the back page. And the back page has the fine print. In the state of New York, what you can do is you can actually appeal your ticket by showing up at court. They give you a court date and time and location on the ticket itself. And so I decided that I was going to appeal using this appeal process and show up in front of the magistrate. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Habakkuk gets an answer from God, and it's kind of like an appeal. God says, here's what I'm going to do, Habakkuk. I'm going to go and get those Babylonians in the next country over. I'm going to kind of rouse the Babylonian army. I'm going to get them to start looking at Israel a little more closely. And Babylon can come in and they can kind of take care of your problems that you're having. Now, for Habakkuk, that is not the solution he was looking for when he cried out to God. He wanted God to come in and save the nation, not destroy it with an incredibly merciless army. And that's what Habakkuk says in a different part of the book, not in our reading today. He says that the Babylonians are murderous, God. Why would you send a murderous nation into your chosen people of Israel to kind of destroy everything? That's not what I wanted you to do. I don't want you to send them in to do all of this damage. Well, so you've got parts 1, 2, and 3 now. That third part is Habakkuk kind of responding to God, which we get in the first part, or in the first part of chapter 2. He sets himself up almost as a watchman on a tower. I will stand at my watch post, Habakkuk says, and station myself on the rampart. I will keep watch to see what he will say to me and what he will answer concerning my complaint. And that answer that he first gave was not sufficient, so Habakkuk waits for the final and fourth part, which is the answer. For me, I decided I was going to appeal the ticket, and I called my more sympathetic of my two parents, which is my father. My mother was not going to have any of it. And Dad told me that he would, of course, drive up to New York, almost 3.5 hours from Philadelphia after my 2-hour drive up. So it was a 5 to 5.5 hour drive for me. And after school one day, I got in the car and picked up Dad, and we had dinner on the way, and got up there by 6:30 or 7 for my appointed court time. And it was a little building. It wasn't like a grand courthouse. It was more like a magistrate's office almost. And I walked in. I had my little coat and tie on because, I was going to court. And the judge said, next case. And I went up and sat there. And he said, it says here you were doing 82 and a 65. Is that true? I said, yes, Your Honor, it's very true. And he said, well, where are you coming from today? And I said, I'm coming from Baltimore, where I work at St. Paul's School. He stopped me. That's great, he said, getting excited. I love teachers. I love when teachers are in my courtroom. You guys aren't in here very often, but thank you. Thank you for your service to our children. He said, so what can I do for you tonight? And I hadn't really thought a lot about it. Didn't use those 5.5 hours productively, but I had seen a lot of Law and Order, and so I said, I throw myself on the mercy of the court. Works on TV. He kind of chuckled and looked at me and he said, son, that's great. He said, I'm gonna do you a favor tonight. And I got all excited. Oh, this is it. This is my great kind of vindication. I'm gonna be let off the hook. I'm gonna cut your court fee in half, he said, and he slammed his gavel and said, next case. And I looked at my ticket, $145 ticket, $20 court fee. I drove over 10 hours, plus had to have dinner with my father for $10. Justice, in my opinion, had not been served that night. And I felt very much like Habakkuk, with God kind of me losing the appeal here. Well, Habakkuk goes back and says this to God, feeling like justice had not been done. And God says something kind of strange. He says, I want you to write down a vision for me. I want you to get out some tablets, some stone tablets, and start writing on them. And if that echoes back to something in the Bible for you, that's good. We're going to come back to that in a second. And Habakkuk writes down this vision on these tablets. And the vision is basically this, that there will be an army with chariots chasing you, and that these waters will part for you, and you will run through on dry land, even though the army behind you will be swallowed up by the sea. Now, if that echoes back to you to the Exodus, to Moses fleeing Egypt, then you're right. That is the vision that Habakkuk writes down based on God's fourth and final answer, or the fourth chapter, or the fourth section. It's all in chapter 3, and it's an interesting vision because what it's telling us is that nations will rise and fall. Nations will be invaded. There is a kind of a cyclical way that nations exist. All nations will fall. All nations will be invaded. And yet the solution is not in the cyclical nature of nations. The solution, the promise, is in the deliverance of God. The freeing, the liberating of the people of Israel from Egypt, going across the Red Sea, coming up even against the waters of the Red Sea with the Egyptian army hot on their tail, going, how are we going to do this, Moses? How are we going to get through? There's no solution in sight. And waiting, and waiting, and waiting almost until the last moment, and then the winds kick up, and the waves start to part, and they walk out on that dry land. That's the promise of God, that new life is found in places we never could have imagined. New life kind of springs up when we least expect it. New life comes even when calamity has struck, even when our perspective is down, even when we feel like the world is coming to an end. God promises exodus for you and for me. I forgot about New York and state troopers and magistrates for a decade. And 2 years ago, I was pulling out of St. Mark's. I go home for my lunch break most days, and we're in a school zone. School zone in the morning when they drop off, and school zone in the afternoon when they pick up 20 miles an hour. But I always forget that there's a school zone in the middle of the day too, when the pre-K picks up over here from about 11:30 to 12:30. And I pulled out here and made a right towards the park, and most days I'm pretty slow heading home, but this day I was kind of distracted, and I ended up pulling out kind of quickly and got up to probably 28 or 30 miles an hour, which is not that fast, but in a school zone it's a little quick. And as I got to the park, I saw a Gardens police officer who whipped his car out, maybe it was a her, whipped the car out and watched me as I drove by, slowed down, lots of eye contact. And the officer pulled out behind me and followed me pretty closely all the way down past Oaks East, all the way to RCA. And I was like, here we go again, because I hadn't gotten a ticket since then. And I was ready with my excuses and all of the things that you do. And as I went straight through RCA, the police officer did a U-turn and came back towards the park. Now, I don't want to say that justice was done that day. That's not my point. My point is that in that moment, I felt like God had given me a little dose of mercy, where I didn't deserve it. It didn't really belong, but yet God had provided just a little piece. And maybe that was because the police officer wasn't doing speed checks. Maybe it's because maybe the cop saw the collar and didn't want to pull over a priest. I don't know. But that's kind of how God works. God works when we least expect it, sometimes in the darkest, most complicated moments of our personal life and our corporate life. God provides an exodus where we didn't ever think there would be one. And in Habakkuk, the most famous line is that the righteous live by their faith. We live by our faith because we can't figure it out otherwise. And so we have to have trust that God has got it figured out. God's got it in the bag. Though nations rise and fall, though injustice seems perverted, though judgment seems to not prevail, God's promises are true, and we cling to them by faith. I want to just end by reading the end of Habakkuk, because we see at the end that Habakkuk describes a barren land. And yet, even in the midst of that barrenness, there is hope. He writes, "I hear and I tremble within. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones, and my steps tremble beneath me. I wait quietly for the day of calamity to come upon the people who attack us. Though the fig tree does not blossom, and no fruit is on the vines, though the produce of the oil fails, and the fields yield no food, though the flock is cut off from the fold, and there is no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exult in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer, and makes me tread upon the heights." We live by faith in the hope that God will bring about an exodus. Amen.